Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Is that a knockoff? Margaret Vance sneered, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the string quartet as she caught Elena's sleeve between two sharp, manicured fingers. Elena Vance didn't flinch, though the cold condensation from Margaret's champagne flute dripped onto her wrist. They stood in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the scent of 1,000 imported lilies and the judgmental stares of the city's elite. Margaret leaned in closer, the smell of her expensive, cloying perfume thick enough to choke. "It's a simple dress, Margaret," Elena said, her voice steady and low. "Appropriate for a teacher's budget, wouldn't you say?" Margaret laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that drew the attention of the nearby guests. "Appropriate? Darling, it's an eyesore. But then again, you've always had a talent for looking like a charity case in a house of gold. It's a wonder you even showed up to your own father's memorial gala looking like the help." A few of the women standing nearby, the same ones who had spent the last hour praising Margaret's resilient spirit, shared a titter of hushed laughter. Elena watched them over the rim of her water glass. She recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same look Margaret had cultivated for years, a mixture of pity and superiority. Margaret turned to the crowd, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "You'll have to forgive my stepdaughter. Elena is so dedicated to her little students that she's forgotten how to dress for civilized society. It's quite noble, really, how she clings to that meager salary while the rest of us manage the weight of the Vance legacy." The insult was calculated, a jagged blade wrapped in velvet. Margaret knew exactly who had managed that legacy. She knew whose signature had quietly authorized the emergency loans that kept the lights on when the gambling debts became too high. She knew, but she also knew Elena would never humiliate the family name by speaking the truth in public. Elena felt the weight of the small, rectangular device in her clutch, a burner phone containing a single, encrypted message from Julian Thorne. He had spent months in the archives, digging through the layers of dust and deception Margaret had used to bury her husband's true final wishes. "The legacy is in good hands, I'm sure," Elena said, her eyes tracking Simon Vance as he approached. Her brother looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his gaze darting between his mother's triumphant grin and Elena's mask of calm. "Mom, maybe we should start the toast," Simon whispered, reaching for Margaret's arm. Margaret brushed him off, her eyes fixed on Elena. "In a moment, Simon. I was just telling Elena that she should enjoy the evening. After all, change is coming. Big change." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss that only Elena could hear. "I'm selling the estate, Elena. The listing goes live tomorrow. I've already secured a penthouse in the city. You can take your books and your noble poverty and find a charming little apartment near the school. I'm done pretending this house belongs to anyone but me." Elena felt a sharp sting in her palms as her nails dug into her skin. This was the house where Arthur Vance had read her stories. The house she had spent 5 years of her life secretly saving from the brink of foreclosure, funneling her inheritance and every cent of her savings into the black hole Margaret had created. "You can't sell it, Margaret," Elena said, her voice a whisper of ice. "This was my father's home." "It was his home," Margaret countered, her smile widening into something predatory. "Now it's my asset, and since you've been so quiet about the family finances all these years, I assume you have no objections. After all, you're just a teacher. What could you possibly know about deeds and titles?" Margaret turned away then, her silk gown swishing against the marble floor as she climbed the 3 steps to the podium. She tapped her microphone, the sound echoing like a gavel through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, her face transforming into a mask of grieving grace. "Thank you for joining us to honor the 10-year anniversary of my late husband's passing. Arthur Vance was a man of tradition, but tonight I am here to announce a new chapter for the Vance family." Elena watched from the shadows of a marble pillar. Claire Vance stood near the stage, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her program. She knew. They all knew something was wrong, but they were too afraid of Margaret's wrath to speak. Elena reached into her bag and felt the cold metal of the flash drive Julian had delivered an hour before the gala began. It contained the original, unedited ledger of the Vance Foundation, the one Margaret thought she had destroyed. "I am officially announcing the sale of the Vance estate," Margaret continued, her voice ringing with feigned emotion. "It is time to let go of the past and embrace a future that reflects the status we have worked so hard to maintain." Applause rippled through the room, though it was hesitant. The guests looked at one another, sensing the shift in power. Margaret stood at the podium, basking in the light, her chin tilted up in a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Elena didn't join the applause. She pulled her phone from her clutch and sent a 3-word text to Julian Thorne. "Initiate the audit." She watched as Margaret raised a glass of vintage champagne, the bubbles dancing in the light. Margaret thought she was ending a chapter. She didn't realize she had just handed Elena the pen. The countdown had begun. In 48 hours, the world would see exactly what Margaret Vance had done to the man who loved her. Elena took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, the coldness a comfort against the heat of her rage. Margaret looked down from the podium, her eyes finding Elena's in the crowd. She offered a small, mocking wave of her glass. Elena didn't wave back. She simply smiled, a thin, dangerous curve of the lips that Margaret had never seen before. The gala was just the beginning. The real show was about to start. The next morning, the Vance estate felt like a tomb wrapped in silk. Elena sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped ceramic mug she'd brought from her own apartment, a small, stubborn piece of her real life in this house of illusions. The air was thick with the cloying scent of Margaret's expensive jasmine perfume and the bitter, oversteeped aroma of Earl Grey. Margaret Vance swept into the room a moment later, her silk robe trailing behind her like a royal shroud. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the night celebrating. She looked like a general surveying a conquered territory. She spared a glance at Elena, her lip curling in a way that suggested she'd found a stain on the pristine white marble. "Still here, Elena?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut the morning quiet. "I assumed you'd have slunk back to that dreary little schoolhouse by now. Some of us have actual business to attend to today, and your presence is distracting." Elena didn't look up from her tea. "The schoolhouse pays the bills, Margaret. Or had you forgotten how bills work in the real world?" A sharp clink echoed through the room as Margaret dropped a heavy silver spoon onto a porcelain saucer. The sound was jarring, a deliberate intrusion of status. "Don't be droll. It doesn't suit your station. Simon, darling, tell your sister about the expansion. It's important she understands where the real heavy lifting in this family happens." Simon Vance sat across from them, his eyes fixed on his tablet, his face pale in the morning light. He looked tired, the weight of his mother's expectations pressing visibly into his shoulders. "Not now, Mother. I'm reviewing the quarterly projections Julian Thorne sent over. Something isn't adding up in the legacy accounts." Margaret waved a dismissive hand, the diamonds on her fingers catching the morning sun and throwing jagged shards of light across the walls. "Julian is an archivist, not an accountant. He sees ghosts in every ledger because his own life is so desperately empty. Focus on the gala's success. We secured 3 new major donors last night. The Vance name has never been more prestigious." Elena felt a cold spark of satisfaction deep in her chest. She knew those projections were a house of cards, held together by Margaret's arrogance and Elena's own silence. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the leather-bound folder Julian had prepared. It contained the real history of the Vance fortune, the gambling debts Margaret had hidden, the forged signatures on Arthur's life insurance, and the steady stream of donations that were actually Elena's own inheritance being funneled back into the estate to keep the lights on. "I'm sure the donors will be fascinated by the full picture," Elena said softly. Margaret froze, her teacup halfway to her lips. Her eyes narrowed into predatory slits. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Only that transparency is a virtue," Elena replied, standing up with a deliberate, calm grace. She adjusted her modest blazer, feeling the weight of the secret she carried like a physical shield. By the way, I saw the courier this morning. There's a notice from the forensic audit team. They'll be here tomorrow afternoon to verify the foundation's assets. The color didn't just leave Margaret's face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving her skin looking like aged parchment. She stood up so quickly her chair screeched against the marble floor, a harsh, discordant sound that made Simon flinch. "You did what? You have no authority to call for an audit. I am the head of this family, Elena. You are a guest by my grace alone." "You're the trustee," Elena corrected, her voice dropping to a level that was terrifyingly steady. "And as a primary beneficiary of Dad's actual estate, the one you've spent 5 years trying to ignore, I have every legal right to ensure the funds aren't being misappropriated." Simon looked up, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "The actual estate? Elena, what are you talking about? Mom said the 2019 filing was the final word." "Mom says a lot of things, Simon," Elena said, turning toward the door. She could feel Margaret's gaze burning into her back, a mixture of pure, unadulterated rage and the first flickers of genuine panic. "You'll regret this," Margaret hissed, her voice trembling with a venomous heat. "I brought you into this house when you had nothing. I gave you a name. I can take it away just as easily as I gave it." Elena paused at the threshold, her hand on the cold brass knob. She didn't look back. "You didn't give me anything, Margaret. You spent years trying to bury me under the weight of your own mistakes. But you forgot one thing about the Vance bloodline." She stepped into the hallway, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat of anticipation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Julian Thorne. "The 48-hour clock is live. The bank has flagged the discrepancies in the offshore accounts." She's trapped, and she doesn't even know the door is locked yet. Elena walked toward the front door, the sound of her own sensible heels echoing with a new, predatory weight against the stone. The countdown hadn't just begun. It was accelerating. Margaret Vance thought she was the queen of this castle, but she was about to find out exactly how much it cost to maintain a crown built on someone else's sacrifice. Elena checked her watch. 24 hours until the first domino fell. She could wait. She had already waited a lifetime. 2 days had passed since Elena Vance walked out of the family estate, but the chill of that house seemed to have settled into her very marrow. She sat in the windowless sanctuary of Julian Thorne's private archive, where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the dry, vanilla-like musk of aging paper. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical thwack of a high-speed scanner as Julian processed a stack of weathered documents. Julian didn't look up from his screen. He was a man who lived in the margins of history, and right now, he was dissecting the Vance family's funeral shroud. He tapped a key, and a high-resolution image bloomed on the monitor. It was a page from a leather-bound book, its edges charred as if someone had tried and failed to commit it to a fireplace. "Mrs. Gable was right to hide this," Julian whispered, his voice echoing in the small space. "Margaret Vance thought she'd burned the evidence of the 2018 restructuring, but this is the hidden ledger, the real one." Elena leaned in, her fingers ghosting over the cold glass of the monitor. Her eyes tracked the columns of numbers, handwritten in the elegant, sloping script of her late father, Arthur Vance. But as the entries progressed into the final months of his life, the handwriting changed. It became tighter, more aggressive. "That's not my father's hand," Elena said, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. "No," Julian agreed. "It's Margaret's. She didn't just manage the accounts while he was ill, Elena. She was rerouting the dividends from the trust your father set up for the local charter school. Look at the dates." Elena felt a sharp, familiar spike of rage. Her father's dying wish had been to secure the future of the school where Elena now taught. Instead, the ledger showed systematic withdrawals, hundreds of thousands of dollars, funneled into a holding company called MV Assets. Before she could speak, her phone vibrated against the metal desk. The screen displayed a contact name she hadn't expected to see so soon, Margaret. Elena answered, pressing the cool plastic to her ear. Immediately, the sound of cloying, expensive lilies seemed to waft through the line, accompanied by the sharp, Rhythmic clack-clack of hangers moving on a high-end boutique rack. "Elena, dear," Margaret's voice was like velvet over shards of glass. "I'm at Claridge's. I found the most divine silk for the gala, but the tailor needs the measurements for your gown. Not that I expect you to fit into anything off the rack with that modest diet of yours. You always did have such a heavy frame, just like your mother's side of the family." Elena closed her eyes, visualizing Margaret standing in the boutique, surrounded by sycophants, holding a flute of vintage champagne while she dismantled her stepdaughter's self-worth for sport. "I'm busy, Margaret," Elena said coldly. "Busy? Doing what? Grading papers for children who will never amount to anything." Margaret let out a light, tinkling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't be tedious. I need you at the house tomorrow morning. There are some papers regarding your father's charitable leftovers that need a final signature. Unless, of course, you'd prefer I simply let the school's roof collapse. It's a tax burden I'm tired of carrying." The audacity was breathtaking. Margaret was asking Elena to sign away the last of the school's protections, likely to cover the very offshore discrepancies Julian had just flagged. "I'll be there," Elena said, her voice a flat line. "Good. Wear something that doesn't smell of chalk if you can manage it. It's embarrassing for the staff." The line went dead. Elena lowered the phone, her knuckles white. She turned back to Julian, who was watching her with a grim expression. "She wants me to sign the final transfer tomorrow," Elena said. "She's desperate," Julian noted, gesturing back to the screen. "And here is why. Look at the last entry in the ledger." He zoomed in on a document tucked into the back of the book. It was a loan application for $10 million taken out 6 months ago. The collateral wasn't the Vance estate or the family business. Elena's breath hitched. "That's my signature." "It's a forgery," Julian said. "A very good one, but the ink density doesn't match the date. Margaret used your name and your personal inheritance as the guarantee for her latest gambling debt in Macau. If that loan defaults, which it will in 48 hours, you lose everything. Your savings, your home, your father's legacy. You'll be the one the banks come for, not her." Elena reached out and touched the brass lock of the physical ledger sitting on the desk. The metal was biting and cold, a tactile reminder of the stakes. Margaret hadn't just stolen Elena's past, she had preemptively sold her future. "She thinks I'm still the girl who hides in the library to avoid her barbs," Elena whispered. She looked at the forged signature, the elegant lie Margaret had crafted to bury her. "She thinks she can invite me into her parlor one last time to finish the job." "What are you going to do?" Julian asked. Elena picked up her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. The weight of the evidence felt like armor. She thought of the school, of her father's legacy, and of the years she had spent absorbing Margaret's poison, thinking it was her duty to keep the peace. "I'm going to the house," Elena said, a predatory calm settling over her. "But I'm not going there to sign anything. I want to see her face when she realizes the door she's been trying to lock is already standing wide open." She walked toward the exit of the archive, her heels clicking against the concrete floor with a new, sharp finality. The countdown was no longer a threat, it was a weapon. Margaret Vance wanted a performance tomorrow morning, and Elena was going to ensure it was a show the entire city would never forget. 24 hours, Elena murmured to the empty hallway. "Wait for it, Margaret, just wait." The following afternoon, the Vance estate smelled of floor wax and Margaret's suffocatingly sweet jasmine perfume. The grand foyer was a hive of activity as caterers moved in and out, preparing for the Vance Legacy Gala. Elena Vance stood by the mahogany staircase, her hand resting on the banister. She could feel the slight vibration of the house, the frantic energy of a woman trying to polish a rotting structure until it shone like gold. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, draped in a silk robe that cost more than Elena's annual teaching salary. She didn't descend. She looked down, her eyes tracking Elena with the clinical detachment of a predator assessing a nuisance. "You're late," Margaret said, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "The legal couriers have already called twice. I told them you were simply being difficult as usual. It's a trait you inherited from your father, that stubborn pride that serves no one." Elena didn't flinch. She watched her stepmother descend the stairs, the click of Margaret's slippers rhythmic and sharp. I wasn't being difficult. I was being thorough. Margaret reached the bottom and stopped just inches from Elena. The scent of her perfume was an assault. Thoroughness is for people with options, Elena. You have a choice. Sign the quitclaim deeds today and receive a modest stipend, or continue this pathetic charade and leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. I've already drafted the press release for tomorrow. The Vance Foundation is moving forward, with or without its most distinguished disappointment. Elena felt the cold weight of the encrypted flash drive in her pocket. It was a small, jagged piece of plastic that held the power to dismantle every lie Margaret had told for 20 years. She let her fingers brush against it, a secret anchor in the storm of Margaret's arrogance. "You seem very confident about tomorrow," Elena said softly. "I am the architect of this family's survival," Margaret snapped, her face tightening. She reached out, adjusting the collar of Elena's modest wool coat with a patronizing tug. "While you were playing martyr in a classroom, I was keeping the wolves from the door. You're a teacher, Elena. You deal in fairy tales and alphabet blocks. I deal in reality. And the reality is that you are irrelevant." Simon Vance stepped into the foyer then, his face pale and his tie loosened. He looked from his mother to his sister, his eyes darting away when they met Elena S. "Mother, the board members from the hospital are on the line. They're asking about the audit discrepancies again." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Tell them it's a clerical error from the previous quarter. Julian Thorne is handling the archives. It's all under control." She turned back to Elena, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "See. Even your little friend Julian is falling in line. Everyone has a price, dear. Even the ones you think are loyal." Elena felt a surge of cold fury, but she kept her expression neutral. The dramatic irony was almost physical. Margaret was bragging about a trap that had already snapped shut around her own ankles. "I suppose you're right," Elena said, her voice steady. "Everyone has a price, but some things are far more expensive than money. You should be careful, Margaret. When you build a house out of glass, you shouldn't throw so many stones." Margaret laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that lacked any genuine mirth. "Is that a threat? From you? You don't have the spine for it. Now get out of my sight. I have a gala to host, and I won't have your dreary presence dampening the mood. If the papers aren't signed by midnight, I'm calling the lockschange service for your apartment. Consider that your final warning." Elena turned toward the door, her heels clicking with a new, sharp finality. She stopped at the threshold and looked back over her shoulder. Margaret was already directing Simon to move a floral arrangement, her back turned to the daughter she thought she had defeated. "I'll be at the gala tomorrow, Margaret," Elena called out. Margaret didn't even look up. "Of course you will. You never could resist a front row seat to my success." "No," Elena whispered to the empty doorway as she stepped out into the cooling evening air. "I just want to be there to see the foundation crumble." She walked to her car, the countdown in her head ticking toward the morning. The evidence was secured, the witnesses were briefed, and the stage was set. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy wouldn't be celebrated. It would be exposed. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a single text to Julian. "Everything is ready. See you at the opening toast." The evening of the Vance Foundation Gala arrived with a suffocating sense of artifice. The grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and crystal, every surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected the hollow smiles of the city's elite. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of overbloomed peonies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Margaret Vance stood at the center of the rotunda, a vision in midnight blue silk that had likely been purchased with a forged signature on a dead man's account. She held a flute of vintage Krug as if it were a scepter, her laughter ringing out with a practiced, melodic pitch that never quite reached her eyes. To the donors surrounding her, she was the grieving widow carrying on a noble legacy. To the woman watching from the shadows of the velvet curtains, she was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Elena Vance adjusted the strap of her clutch, feeling the hard, rectangular weight of the encrypted flash drive inside. It felt heavier than it was, a leaden anchor of truth in a room built on buoyancy. She had chosen a dress of charcoal gray, simple, elegant, and entirely invisible against the backdrop of the ostentatious displays around her. She wasn't here to be seen, she was here to witness. "You're late!" a voice hissed near her ear. Elena turned to see Simon Vance. He looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his collar seemingly a fraction too tight. He was nursing a scotch, his eyes darting toward their mother. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Simon," Elena said, her voice a cool contrast to the frantic energy radiating from her brother. "Mother is on the warpath," he whispered, leaning in. "She's already told the board that you're here as a guest of the family only. She warned them that you might try to make a scene about the inheritance. She's painting you as the bitter, unstable daughter." Elena felt a spark of the familiar rage, but she smothered it instantly. She didn't need heat, she needed ice. Let her paint. The canvas is about to be shredded anyway. She moved away from him, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, predatory precision against the marble floor. As she crossed the room, she caught the eye of Julian Thorne. He was standing near the technician's booth at the back of the hall, looking every bit the unassuming archivist in a slightly ill-fitting suit. He gave a single, microscopic nod. The feed was live. The documents were queued. "Elena, there you are." The voice was like a whip crack. Margaret had detached herself from a group of diamond-clad socialites and was gliding toward her. The smile on her face was a masterpiece of condescension. She didn't stop until she was inches away, the scent of her perfume, something rare and prohibitively expensive, filling Elena's lungs like a toxin. "I was beginning to hope you'd had the good sense to stay in your little apartment," Margaret said, her voice low enough that only Elena could hear. She reached out, her fingers, manicured to lethal points, flicking a stray thread on Elena's shoulder. "That dress is brave. It reminds me of the rags your father's people used to wear in the country. It's a shame you couldn't find something that didn't scream public school salary." "The clothes are fine, Margaret," Elena replied, her gaze unwavering. "I'm more concerned with the foundation. Julian tells me the audit is nearly complete." Margaret's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine venom darting through the mask. "That little rat, I've already had his access revoked. Anything he thinks he found is a hallucination. You're playing a losing hand, Elena. Tomorrow, I'll have the board sign the final dissolution papers, and you'll be lucky if I leave you enough for a bus ticket out of this city." She leaned closer, her breath warm against Elena's cheek. "You never had your father's stomach for this. You're soft. You're a teacher. You deal in fairy tales and children's rhymes. This is the real world, and in the real world, the person with the pen makes the rules." "Then it's a good thing I brought my own ink," Elena whispered. Margaret let out a sharp, dismissive laugh and turned back to the room, raising her glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The room began to settle. The clinking of silverware against china died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Claire Vance appeared at the edge of the stage, looking pale and fragile, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked like a ghost at her own funeral. Margaret began to climb the small stairs to the podium, her movements fluid and regal. She looked out over the sea of wealth and power, the light from the chandeliers catching the sequins on her gown until she seemed to glow. "Tonight is about legacy," Margaret began, her voice projected through the hidden speakers with a velvet warmth. "It is about the man we lost, Arthur Vance, and the dream he entrusted to me. A dream of stability, of honor, and of a family name that stands for something more than just money." Elena moved toward the side of the stage, her hand sliding into her clutch. She felt the cool metal of the drive. She looked at Julian. He was hovering over the laptop, his fingers poised. "Many have questioned the future of the Vance Foundation," Margaret continued, her gaze sweeping over the board members seated at the front table. "They have whispered about debt, about mismanagement, but I stand before you tonight to say that the Vance legacy has never been stronger. We are entering a new era of prosperity." She paused for dramatic effect, a triumphant smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. She thought she was delivering the closing argument of her life. She thought she had won. Elena stepped out from the shadows, moving into the light at the base of the stage. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She simply waited until Margaret's eyes found hers. In that moment, the air in the room seemed to thin. The countdown in Elena's head hit 0. She saw Margaret's hand tighten on the edge of the podium, the knuckles turning white. The older woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in the porcelain. "And now," Margaret said, her voice wavering just enough for the front row to notice, "I would like to share a special presentation on our projected growth for the coming year." She signaled to the tech booth. She expected the glowing logo of the foundation to appear on the massive screen behind her. She expected a series of doctored graphs and inflated numbers. Instead, the screen flickered, then went black. A low hum filled the ballroom, vibrating through the soles of Elena's shoes. "Julian," Elena breathed. A single document appeared on the screen. It wasn't a graph. It was a scanned copy of a bank ledger, the header clearly marked with the Vance estate seal. Across the center, in bold, red digital ink, was the word, insolvent. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. Margaret froze, her mouth slightly open, the color beginning to drain from her cheeks as the first gasps echoed through the hall. Elena didn't look at the screen. She kept her eyes locked on her mother's face, watching the foundation finally begin to crumble. The air in the ballroom curdled. The hum of the projector, previously a background drone, now sounded like a death rattle in the sudden, suffocating silence. Margaret Vance did not move. For a heartbeat, she remained frozen in her pose of practiced elegance, her hand still raised as if to toast her own genius. Then, the collapse began. Margaret's composure didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The carefully curated mask of the Vance matriarch shattered, revealing a frantic, hollow-eyed woman underneath. The skin on her neck turned a mottled, angry purple before the color vanished entirely, leaving her features as gray as the marble beneath her feet. Her lips, painted a perfect, defiant red, parted and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound escaped the tight column of her throat. The diamond necklace at her throat, a piece she'd bragged was a family heirloom, seemed to choke her as her breathing became shallow and erratic. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide now, the pupils blown as they fixed on the red digital ink on the screen. She looked small, suddenly and violently stripped of the armor her wealth provided, her hands trembling so fiercely that the champagne glass she held rattled against her wedding ring with a rhythmic, frantic clicking. The sound of the glass was the only thing that broke the stillness until Simon Vance stepped toward the dais. His face was a mask of dawning horror as he looked at the screen, then at his mother, then back at the numbers that detailed a decade of systematic theft. "Mother," he whispered. The word wasn't a question. It was a plea for a lie he could actually believe. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but his hand stopped inches away, recoiling as if she were made of something contagious. Behind them, the board members were already in motion. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply stood, a collective withdrawal of shadow and support. The chairman, a man who had been Arthur Vance's closest friend for 40 years, didn't even look at Margaret. He adjusted his cufflinks, his face set in a grim line of disgust, and walked toward the exit. The others followed suit, their chairs scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. Claire Vance remained in her seat, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, jagged sobs. The smell of expensive lilies and vintage champagne suddenly felt cloying, the scent of a funeral rather than a celebration. Elena stood perfectly still at the edge of the stage. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence was her ally. She watched the woman who had spent years calling her a disappointment, a burden, and a failure. "The foundation is a ghost, Margaret," Elena said, her voice a low, steady blade that cut through the remaining tension. "You didn't just lose the money. You spent it. You gambled with the estate, and when that ran dry, you started forging Father's signature on the trust amendments." Margaret finally found her voice, though it was a jagged, ugly thing. "You're lying," she shrieked, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. She turned to the dwindling crowd, her eyes wild, her hair beginning to fray from its perfect coil. "This is a fabrication. Julian Thorne is a disgruntled archivist, and she is a bitter girl seeking revenge because she was never good enough for this family." She pointed a shaking finger at Elena, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "Security, get her out of here." "Shut that screen off," but no one moved. The security guards, men who had been on the Vance payroll for years, stayed rooted to the perimeter. Their eyes weren't on Margaret. They were fixed on Julian, who stood at the back of the room holding a single, notarized document. "The original ledger is in the vault, Margaret," Elena said, her calm a direct insult to the other woman's mounting mania. "The one you thought you burned. Mrs. Gable has the key, and she's already given her statement to the auditors." Margaret's knees buckled. She caught the edge of the linen-covered table, her weight dragging the cloth down, sending silverware and crystal crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass signaled the end of the Vance dynasty. Elena didn't stay to watch her crawl. She had spent a lifetime waiting for this moment, but the satisfaction wasn't in the shouting. It was in the silence she left behind. She turned her back on the wreckage and began to walk toward the heavy oak doors, her steps rhythmic and sure. "Elena," Margaret's voice was a desperate, broken howl. "You think you've won? You have no idea what I did to keep this family together." Elena stopped but didn't turn around. She adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of the truth finally settled. "I know exactly what you did, Mother. That's why the police are waiting in the foyer." She stepped through the doors, the cool night air hitting her face as the first blue and red lights began to pulse against the manicured hedges of the estate. Behind her, the screaming started, but Elena was already gone. The foyer of the Vance estate, once a cathedral of old money and whispered secrets, was now flooded with the sterile, pulsing glow of police cruisers. The light cut through the stained glass above the door, painting Margaret Vance in jagged stripes of crimson and blue. She stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her hand white-knuckled on the mahogany banister. She wasn't screaming anymore. She had retreated into the cold, brittle armor of her status. "This is an embarrassment," she said, her voice trembling with a forced, regal disdain. She looked at the two officers as if they were unwashed intruders in her private gallery. "Do you have any idea whose home you've entered? My husband built this town. You will be out of a job by sunrise." The lead officer didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the man standing in the shadows of the library door. Julian Thorne stepped forward into the light, carrying a heavy, leather-bound ledger and a slim digital drive. He looked tired, but his gaze was steady, the look of a man who had spent months unburying a corpse piece by piece. "The warrant isn't based on an embarrassment, Margaret," Julian said, his voice echoing in the sudden, hollow silence of the hall. "It's based on 3 years of systematic embezzlement from the family trust and the documented forgery of Arthur's signature on the secondary life insurance policy." He handed a single sheet of paper to the officer. It was a forensic analysis of the signature Margaret had used to drain the accounts 3 weeks after the funeral. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty's final heartbeat. Margaret's hand slipped from the banister. The last of her composure didn't just break, it evaporated. Her jaw slackened, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made her look 20 years older in an instant. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of wet ash, while her eyes darted from the document to the faces of her children, finding no sanctuary. Her nostrils flared with a sharp, ragged breath that rattled in her throat, her chin trembling so violently that she had to bite her lip to keep it still, though a thin trail of saliva escaped the corner of her mouth. Her shoulders, usually held with military precision, slumped forward as if the very air in the room had gained the weight of lead. Simon Vance took a step back from her, his face a mask of dawning horror. He had been the favored one, the son she had shielded with lies and bought with stolen inheritance. He looked at the ledger in Julian's hand, then at his mother's collapsing face. "You told me the money was gone because of Elena's spending," he whispered, the betrayal cracking his voice. "You let us treat her like a parasite while you were the one feeding on us." "I did it for you," she hissed, a desperate, ugly sound. She reached out for him, her fingers clawing at the air, but he recoiled as if her touch were toxic. Claire Vance stood near the shadows of the dining room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't say a word, but the way she looked at her mother, with a cold, clinical pity, seemed to hurt more than Simon's anger. "It wasn't just the money, was it?" Claire asked softly. From the top of the servants' stairs, a small, shadowed figure appeared. Mrs. Gable descended slowly, her uniform pressed and her expression unreadable. She held a small, silver key in her hand. The key to the private safe Arthur had kept in the study. The one Margaret claimed had been lost years ago. "I saw her do it," the housekeeper said, her voice thin but unbreakable. "I saw her take the papers from his desk while his body was still in the house. She told me if I ever spoke, I'd be on the street without a penny or a reference. I've kept the logs, Julian, every visitor, every late-night shredding session." Margaret turned toward the housekeeper, her eyes wide and wild. "You're a servant. No one will listen to a word you—" "They already have," Elena said. She stood by the open front door, the cool night air blowing her hair across her face. She looked at the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to diminish her, trying to turn her own siblings against her, and felt a strange, hollow lack of anger. The rage had burned out, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of the truth. The lead officer stepped forward, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing off the marble floors. The sound was final, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a long, crooked sentence. "Margaret Vance, you are under arrest for grand larceny, fraud, and embezzlement," the officer stated, his voice devoid of emotion. As they moved to secure her wrists, she began to struggle, a frantic, undignified thrashing that knocked a crystal vase from a side table. It shattered against the floor, the sound of breaking glass a perfect mirror to her life. She looked toward Elena, her face twisted into a mask of pure, concentrated venom. "You think you've won," she spat, even as they began to lead her toward the door. "You're nothing without this name. You'll be a common schoolteacher in a rented room while I'm already a teacher, Mother," Elena said, her voice calm as a frozen lake. "And I've already moved my things. As for the name, you're the one who dragged it through the mud. I'm just the one who stopped the bleeding." Elena watched as they led her mother down the stone steps. The neighbors were beginning to appear on their lawns, their silhouettes dark against the glowing windows of their own perfect lives. The scandal would be the talk of the valley for a decade, a cautionary tale of greed and the slow, inevitable turn of the karmic wheel. Julian walked over to Elena, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. "It's over. The forensic team will be here in the morning to go through the rest of the files. The house is legally under the trust's control now, which means it's yours, Simon's, and Claire's." Elena looked up at the towering ceiling, at the portraits and the gold leaf, and felt a shiver of revulsion. "I don't want it. Sell it. Give the proceeds to the pension fund she raided." She turned her back on the foyer, on the shattered crystal, and on the siblings who were only now beginning to realize the cost of their silence. She stepped out into the night, the air smelling of rain and damp earth. She didn't look back as the police car pulled away, its sirens silent but its lights still staining the trees. She began to walk down the long, winding driveway, her heels clicking rhythmically on the gravel. She had entered this house a week ago as a disgraced daughter. She was leaving it as something else entirely. Behind her, the lights of the estate flickered once and went dark. Elena didn't stop. She had spent enough of her life in the shadows of that house, and for the first time, the road ahead was perfectly clear. 6 months later, the air in the city had turned crisp with the arrival of autumn, a sharp contrast to the humid, suffocating night Elena Vance had walked away from her family home. She sat in a sun-drenched office on the 14th floor of a glass-fronted building, the scent of fresh white lilies and expensive printer ink replacing the oppressive smell of dust and old secrets. On the door, the gold lettering was modest but firm, the Vance Restitution Foundation. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes tracking the final disbursements on her monitor. Every cent recovered from the hidden offshore accounts Margaret Vance had tried to squirrel away was finally flowing back to the pensioners she had defrauded. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a systematic dismantling of her mother's legacy of greed. A soft knock at the door preceded Julian Thorne. He looked different without the shadow of the Vance archives hanging over him, his posture straighter, his expression lighter. He placed a thick manila folder on her desk, the heavy thud of paper echoing in the quiet room. "The final audit is complete," Julian said, his voice warm. "The estate sale closed this morning. The house is officially no longer in the family name." Elena felt a strange, hollow thrum in her chest. She had spent a lifetime trying to earn a place in that house, only to realize its foundation was built on sand. "Who bought it?" "A land trust," he replied. "They're turning the grounds into a public nature preserve. The house itself will be a community library. I think your father would have liked that." She nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. She didn't miss the marble foyers or the gold leaf. She missed the man who had taught her that integrity was the only currency that mattered. She touched the smooth surface of the folder, a tactile reminder of the work they had done. The afternoon brought different visitors. Simon Vance and Claire Vance arrived together, looking humbler than she had ever seen them. Simon was dressed in a simple button-down, the flashy designer watches and arrogance of his previous life stripped away. He had spent the last few months working in a mid-level accounting firm, actually earning a paycheck for the first time in his 30 years. Claire had enrolled in a teaching program, her voice finally steady and independent. "We just wanted to check in," Simon said, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked at the office, his eyes lingering on the photos of the victims Elena had helped. "The news about the house. It's for the best, Elena. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what she was doing to you, to all of us." "We're trying," Claire added softly. "Mrs. Gable moved into that retirement community you recommended. She's happy. She says the tea there is better than anything we ever served her." The sisters shared a brief, bittersweet look. The cost of their mother's vanity had been their collective childhood, but the silence between them was no longer filled with suspicion. It was a fragile, new beginning. When they left, Elena prepared for the task she dreaded most. The visitation room at the correctional facility smelled of industrial lemon bleach and stale coffee. Elena sat behind the reinforced glass, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Margaret was let in, the shock of it nearly made Elena flinch. The woman who had once demanded the finest silks and commanded every room she entered was now draped in a shapeless gray jumpsuit. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and dull. Margaret Vance picked up the phone, her eyes still burning with a cold, flickering resentment. "Have you come to gloat, Elena? To see me in this cage?" "I've come to bring you the final papers," Elena said, her voice like glass. "The house is gone. The accounts are empty. The restitution is complete." Margaret's face contorted, a mask of entitlement that refused to slip even now. "You destroyed us. You took everything I worked for. I did it for your future. I did it so you wouldn't have to live like a commoner." "You did it for yourself, Mother," Elena replied, her tone devoid of the anger that used to consume her. "You traded your children's souls for a title and a zip code. Simon is working. Claire is studying. They're actually living. You didn't give us a future. You gave us a prison." "I'm the only one who realized I had the key." "You're ungrateful," Margaret hissed, her knuckles white as she gripped the receiver. "After everything I gave you." "You gave me nothing but a name I had to spend 6 months scrubbing clean," Elena interrupted. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. "This is the last time I'm coming here. The foundation is moving its headquarters to the city. I've signed over the remaining personal items to Simon and Claire. I don't want any of it." "You'll crawl back," Margaret sneered, though her voice wavered as she realized Elena was actually walking toward the door. "You're a Vance. You need me." Elena paused at the heavy steel door. She looked back one last time at the woman who had tried to break her. Margaret looked small, huddling in the gray light of the prison, her shadow long and twisted on the floor. "I'm not a Vance anymore," Elena said quietly. "I'm just Elena." She stepped out into the crisp autumn afternoon. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers across the pavement. She walked toward her car, her heels clicking rhythmically, a sound of purpose rather than performance. The road ahead wasn't paved with gold or lined with portraits of ancestors, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back to see who was following. She was simply moving forward into the light.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.